What if I told you that some of the most celebrated sci-fi movies in history weren't just entertainment, they were battlegrounds? These films didn't just stretch imaginations, they cracked open the rules of what could be shown on screen. They sparked outrage, rewrote guidelines, and left censors scrambling. But here's the real question. Why were audiences so afraid of stories that revealed their own fears? Buckle up, because these sci-fi controversies changed everything you thought was safe. Frankenstein, 1931. It looked like just another monster movie. But when Universal's Frankenstein hit theaters in 1931, it didn't just shock audiences with Boris Karloff's stitched-up face. It terrified Hollywood itself. The problem wasn't the lightning bolts or the grave robbing. It was one single line of dialogue. When Dr. Frankenstein screamed, "Now I know what it feels like to be God." Church groups, parents, and politicians exploded in outrage. That one sentence was labeled blasphemous and sparked calls for censorship boards to clamp down hard. Several states actually banned the movie. Other versions were chopped up with scenes removed, including the infamous moment where the monster drowns a little girl. By the time re-releases rolled around, different cuts existed all over the country. Universal had to scramble, sometimes trimming the film so heavily that storylines didn't even make sense anymore. The fallout was massive. Hollywood executives, terrified of more boycotts, created stricter self-policing rules. In other words, Frankenstein didn't just create a monster on screen, it created a monster in the boardrooms, a monster called censorship. It set the stage for 3 decades of strict Hollywood codes. Ironically, the film's banned scenes are now its most famous. It's proof that what society tries to bury usually crawls back to life stronger than before. Island of Lost Souls. 1932. You've heard of the Island of Dr. Moreau, but when Paramount adapted it in 1932 as Island of Lost Souls, they unleashed something so disturbing that even censors couldn't believe it hit theaters. This wasn't spooky fun. This was torture, human-animal hybrids, and unsettling body horror presented with a straight face. The biggest shock came with Charles Laughton's creepy doctor. Moreau and his House of Pain, a laboratory where screaming victims underwent grotesque experiments. Audiences weren't used to hearing such disturbing cries in a mainstream movie. Critics blasted it as sadistic and repellent. And in Britain, the film was outright banned until 1958. That's right, it sat locked away for more than 25 years. American censors hacked away at dialogue and visuals, but the core terror was impossible to hide. Animal rights groups hated the way vivisection was portrayed. Religious organizations protested its unnatural creations. The controversy was so intense that H.G. Wells himself, who wrote the novel, called it repulsive. Here's the irony. All that outrage turned it into a cult legend. Later generations praised it as one of the most daring pre-code horror sci-fi hybrids. But in 1932, Island of Lost Souls terrified audiences, not because of monsters on screen, but because it dared to ask what happens when science crosses boundaries. And that was scarier than any werewolf or vampire. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1931. Robert Louis Stevenson's tale of split personalities wasn't new, but the 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, directed by Ruben Mamoulian, went so far that it helped shut the door on Hollywood freedom. This wasn't your father's monster flick. Frederick March played a doctor who transformed into a violent creature, shown through shocking makeup and camera tricks that left audiences gasping. What rattled people most were the transformations themselves. Hyde wasn't just a monster, he was a disturbing, abusive brute. Scenes of his cruelty made audiences squirm. Critics at the time called it immoral. Parents claimed it glorified brutality, and state censorship boards quickly demanded cuts. By the mid-1930s, when the Hays Code was enforced, this movie was Exhibit A in arguments that Hollywood had gone too far. The film also created another scandal. MGM bought the rights a decade later just to bury this version, fearing it was too powerful and would overshadow their sanitized remake. Imagine that, an entire movie locked away because it was considered too raw. Frederick March won an Academy Award for his performance, but the real legacy was the panic it caused. Censors cracked down on anything that looked too violent, too intense, or too real. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde showed the world that when a film exposes the dark side of human nature, the scariest transformation happens off screen in the form of censorship rules slamming shut. The Black Cat, 1934. Don't be fooled by the title. The Black Cat, starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, wasn't a spooky kitten story. It was one of the most disturbing films of the 1930s, and it nearly blew the lid off what Hollywood could show. Released during the last gasps of the pre-code era, it featured satanic rituals, necrophilia hints, and torture scenes that censors simply couldn't ignore. The most infamous moment, a character being skinned alive. Even though the camera cut away, the screams and suggestions were enough to make audiences faint. Critics called it the most unspeakable horror ever shown. Some theaters refused to screen it. Others demanded entire reels be cut. What made the film truly dangerous was its tone. Instead of portraying evil as cartoonish, it presented disturbing ideas with a sleek, stylish polish. Suddenly, the bad guys looked too compelling, and that terrified watchdog groups. Within months, the Hays Code was enforced with an iron fist, and the Black Cat became one of the last wild gasps of pre-code Hollywood. Today, it's celebrated for its daring artistry. But back then, it was viewed as a film that crossed the final line. If Frankenstein created the monster of censorship, the Black Cat locked the chains tight around Hollywood's imagination for decades to come. The Thing from Another World, 1951. By the 1950s, science fiction had turned into Cold War propaganda. But Howard Hawks's The Thing from Another World added an edge that censors didn't like. On the surface, it was a monster movie about an alien discovered in the Arctic. But dig deeper, and it was a story about paranoia, science run amok, and mistrust of authority. The military was shown as clashing with scientists. The message, blind faith in science could be dangerous. For Cold War America, that was a risky statement. Some states even censored lines of dialogue that linked unchecked science to political threats. Critics argued it was anti-American, yet audiences loved it. The claustrophobic setting, the shocking violence for its time, and the undertone of nuclear fear made it unforgettable. Even without showing much gore, the suspense was so intense that parents wrote letters demanding it be toned down. The controversy only fueled its success. It inspired decades of paranoid sci-fi, from Invasion of the Body Snatchers to John Carpenter's 1982 remake. But make no mistake, The Thing from Another World didn't just scare people with a monster in ice. It scared people by daring to question who to trust in a world where science and politics collided. And that made censors very nervous. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956. It looked like a creepy alien thriller about pods replacing humans. But Invasion of the Body Snatchers wasn't just a sci-fi flick. It was a political grenade lobbed right into Cold War America. The ambiguity was what made it dangerous. Was it warning against communist infiltration, with everyday people secretly replaced by emotionless doubles? Or was it a satire about McCarthyism, showing the paranoia of accusing your neighbor of being an enemy? Nobody could agree. And that was the problem. Conservatives claimed it exposed the fear of Reds hiding in plain sight. Liberals said it was a bold takedown of witch hunts and blind conformity. Both sides wrote angry letters, accusing the filmmakers of pushing propaganda. Some towns even refused to screen it, fearing it would stir division. The finale, where the hero screams, "They're here already, you're next," was originally supposed to end in despair, leaving audiences convinced humanity was doomed. Censors hated that idea. The studio forced a tacked-on, hopeful ending with doctors and FBI agents, trying to calm things down. But the paranoia still seeped through. Body Snatchers proved that the scariest monsters weren't aliens at all. They were human fear and suspicion. By pushing buttons on both sides of the political spectrum, it became one of the most hotly debated sci-fi films ever made. And it taught Hollywood a lesson. When you play with paranoia, expect censors to come knocking. The Fly, 1958. On paper, The Fly sounded ridiculous. A scientist experiments with teleportation, mixes up with a fly, and mutates. But when audiences saw it on screen in 1958, they weren't laughing, they were horrified. And censors were furious. The big shock wasn't the monster reveal. It was the grotesque body horror along the way. Scenes of deformed experiments, buzzing nightmares, and that unforgettable cry, "Help me," as a tiny human-headed fly gets trapped in a spider's web. Even today, that moment feels unsettling. But back then, it was nightmare fuel. Some theaters refused to show it. Parents complained their children had sleepless nights. Censorship boards demanded cuts to the transformation scenes, calling them too ghastly. For TV reruns, entire segments were toned down or removed, making the movie almost incomprehensible. And here's the twist. Critics dismissed it as pulp trash, but word of mouth from terrified audiences turned it into a cult hit. The more censors tried to cut, the more people wanted to see it uncut. The Fly showed Hollywood that body horror could terrify without oceans of blood. It forced censors to recognize that suggestion and sound could be as disturbing as visuals. The movie's legacy, proof that sometimes a whisper or a tiny cry of "help me" can be more controversial than a scream. Planet of the Apes, 1968. You think Planet of the Apes was just about guys in monkey suits? Think again. This 1968 classic was one of the most subversive sci-fi movies ever made, and censors knew it. Beneath the spectacle was a sharp critique of human nature, war, and blind faith in authority. And that ending, it made jaws drop across the globe. When Charlton Heston falls to his knees before the half-buried Statue of Liberty, audiences realized the shocking truth. This wasn't another planet. It was Earth, destroyed by humanity itself. Studios panicked about how audiences would react to such a bleak vision. Censors feared the apocalyptic reveal would be too demoralizing during a tense political climate, and that wasn't the only controversy. The film openly tackled race, class, and civil rights through allegory. Ape society mirrored America's divisions, with chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans representing different hierarchies. Critics called it too political for mass audiences. Some schools even banned screenings, worried students would misinterpret its message. Yet Planet of the Apes became a box office smash. Its mix of popcorn thrills and biting social commentary made it unforgettable. And in forcing censors to wrestle with political allegory, it proved sci-fi could be more than escapism. It could be a mirror, one many people weren't ready to look into. A Clockwork Orange, 1972. Here's where things got ugly. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange wasn't just controversial, it was radioactive. Based on Anthony Burgess's novel, it told the story of Alex, a violent delinquent forced into psychological conditioning by the state. From the first screenings, outrage poured in. In the US, the MPAA slapped it with an X rating for its graphic violence and disturbing imagery. Theaters that did show it were mobbed by protesters. Critics were split between calling it genius and the most dangerous film ever made. Some politicians argued it should be banned outright. Kubrick didn't back down. He insisted the film was a warning about government control and the loss of free will. But audiences fixated on the brutality and surreal style. Rumors swirled about copycat crimes, adding fuel to the fire. In some states, theaters were pressured into pulling it from their lineups. What's important is how it changed censorship. The MPAA scrambled to rethink ratings, eventually using A Clockwork Orange as a case study in how to handle adult content in mainstream cinema. It proved science fiction could be as shocking and as censored as any drama or thriller. Decades later, its reputation remains split, masterpiece or menace. But one thing's certain, no film tested the boundaries of American censorship quite like this one. Soylent Green Meal, 1973, this revelation wasn't a meme, it was a shock that left audiences stunned. Soylent Green imagined a future where overpopulation and environmental collapse pushed society into grotesque solutions. And that ending, it hit way too close to home. Censors worried that its themes of government corruption, corporate greed, and food scarcity were too disturbing for a mass audience. Some countries demanded cuts, while American television later softened or outright removed the infamous reveal for broadcasts. Parents complained it was too bleak for teenagers, and critics labeled it apocalyptic propaganda. But that's exactly why it mattered. At a time when people were already panicking about pollution, overpopulation, and energy shortages, the film acted like a mirror held up to society's darkest fears. Instead of ray guns and aliens, it showed humanity eating itself, literally and figuratively. The backlash only cemented its legend. For years, Soylent Green was used as a cultural shorthand for dystopia. and the censorship fights it triggered showed Hollywood that the most shocking sci-fi wasn't about monsters or spaceships. It was about forcing people to face what they didn't want to admit. The future we fear is often the one we're already building. Westworld, 1973. Before HBO's sleek reboot, the original Westworld was already stirring up trouble. Michael Crichton's film, starring Yul Brynner as a murderous android gunslinger, looked like a simple sci-fi thriller about a theme park gone wrong. But what shocked audiences in 1973 wasn't just the action. It was the film's unnerving ideas about technology, morality, and human indulgence. The concept of a park where guests lived out violent fantasies was deeply unsettling. Critics called it immoral tourism. Censors zeroed in on the realistic violence, which was far more graphic than audiences expected from mainstream sci-fi. The MPAA nearly gave it an X rating, arguing it blurred the line between entertainment and cruelty. What made it worse? The film suggested humans, not robots, were the real villains. Guests exploited androids for fun, treating them as disposable. That critique of human nature made studios nervous. Some theaters even warned parents it was not suitable for younger teens, despite its PG rating. The backlash forced Hollywood to rethink what family-friendly science fiction could look like. Gone were the days of harmless spacemen and laser guns. Westworld showed the genre could dive into darker questions about technology and ethics, and that meant censors had to scramble to catch up. Decades later, its influence is obvious. But back in 1973, Westworld was less a theme park fantasy and more a wake-up call, one that made watchdogs wonder if some sci-fi rides were just too dangerous to let people board. Logan's Run, 1976. In 1976, Logan's Run looked like pure futuristic escapism. A domed city, glowing costumes, and a society where everyone lived carefree until they hit age 30. Then came renewal. The problem? It wasn't renewal at all. It was state-sanctioned extermination. Audiences were shocked by how blunt the film was. The premise forced viewers to ask, what happens when society decides your time is up? Censors hated the imagery of the deadly ritual known as carousel, where people floated into the air before being vaporized. Critics called it disturbing masquerading as fun. But there was more. The film featured bold depictions of freedom, rebellion, and questioning authority. It walked right up to the edge of the PG rating, with studios worrying they might alienate family audiences. Some theaters even labeled it for mature viewers only. It became a case study for why the PG rating wasn't enough, a debate that helped pave the way for the creation of PG-13 a few years later. What truly rattled people was the subtext. In a decade worried about overpopulation, government overreach, and the energy crisis, Logan's Run felt uncomfortably relevant. Censors tried to soften its imagery, but the message remained clear. When society values control over freedom, the results are chilling. For many, the most disturbing part wasn't the science fiction spectacle, it was realizing how easily utopia can turn into a polished death trap. Star Wars 1977. Yes, the film that redefined blockbuster entertainment was also a lightning rod. When Star Wars blasted into theaters in 1977, it looked like harmless space opera. But censors and parent groups didn't see it that way. They saw violence, strange spiritual powers, and merchandising aimed squarely at kids. The biggest controversy came from its PG rating. Parents complained it was too intense for younger children. The death of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, shown as charred remains, sparked letters demanding a stricter classification. Critics argued that the lightsaber duels and dogfights were too graphic for what was marketed as a family film. Some even pushed for a brand new middle rating, a fight that led directly to the eventual creation of PG-13 in the 1980s. Another sore spot was its spiritual undertones. The Force sounded mystical, and watchdog groups worried kids would take it as a belief system. Merchandising also caused outrage. For the first time, a blockbuster wasn't just a movie. It was toys, lunchboxes, and a billion-dollar machine. Parents and teachers worried about selling a fantasy world to impressionable kids. The irony? All that controversy only made it bigger. Star Wars wasn't just a film, it was a cultural shift. And it proved that even when critics and censors push back, sometimes the most dangerous sci-fi is the one that sneaks into every living room, every backpack, and every kid's imagination. Altered States, 1980. Science, psychedelics, and body horror collided in Altered States. Directed by Ken Russell, this film followed a Harvard scientist experimenting with sensory deprivation tanks and hallucinogenic substances, eventually devolving into grotesque transformations. The result? A film so bizarre that censors didn't know what to do with it. The body distortion sequences were shocking. Bones cracked, skin shifted, and the protagonist regressed into a primitive creature. Critics said it was too disturbing for mainstream audiences. The MPAA debated an X rating, forcing Russell to fight tooth and nail to keep it at R. Some theaters even placed warning signs outside, cautioning viewers about the intensity of the imagery. What rattled people most was its mix of scientific theory with trippy visuals. It wasn't a monster movie. It was a hallucinatory nightmare suggesting that the human body and mind could unravel under pressure. Censors hated the unpredictability. Was it science fiction, horror, experimental cinema? It didn't fit their boxes, and that made it more dangerous. The film's chaotic production only added to the legend. Screenwriter Paddy Chayefsky hated the final product so much he removed his name, claiming Russell had turned his story into a freak show. But for audiences, the controversy was magnetic. Altered States didn't just push visual boundaries, it proved sci-fi could be experimental art that slipped through the cracks of censorship. It left people arguing for decades whether it was genius or gibberish. Either way, it left scars. Robocop, 1987. Part man, part machine, all trouble for the censors. Paul Verhoeven's Robocop looked like a flashy action film on the surface, but underneath was a savage satire of corporate greed, media, and police brutality. And when it hit the MPAA's desk, chaos erupted. The violence was off the charts. From the boardroom executive shredded by machine gun fire to the grotesque death of Emil, splattered by toxic waste, the MPAA initially slapped the movie with an X rating. Verhoeven was forced to trim scenes again and again, rumor has it over a dozen times, before finally getting an R. But it wasn't just the gore. The film's unflinching look at privatized policing and corrupt corporations made studios nervous. Some critics claimed it was anti-American. Parent groups blasted the marketing, arguing that the action figures aimed at kids ignored the movie's brutal tone. Despite, or maybe because of, the controversy, Robocop became a cult sensation. It showed that sci-fi could deliver both shocking spectacle and biting commentary, and by forcing the MPAA to rethink what too violent meant, it reshaped how action and sci-fi films would be rated for decades. In the end, Robocop wasn't just about law enforcement in a dystopian Detroit. It was about censorship itself, showing how power struggles happen not only on screen, but also in the editing room. So, there you have it. 15 sci-fi films that didn't just entertain, they rattled censors, parents, and entire governments. These weren't just stories about monsters, spaceships, or future worlds. They were stories about us, about what we fear and what we try to hide. Which of these films do you think pushed the hardest against the rules? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and remember, sometimes the real controversy isn't on screen. It's what happens when the lights come up.